Okay, let's open with a word of prayer. Father, we thank you for gathering us this morning to remember the royal priesthood that you have died for us for our sins, not just so that now we have life with you and we thank you for that, but that you have also formed us into a royal priesthood so that we can connect people to God. And Lord, so in that regard, we want to delve into your truth, to be able to explain the truth of God to a world in need of a Savior. So Lord, today we are so thankful that you have given us this opportunity to learn. So Lord, open our ears to hear. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Today we have a guest speaker. His name is Dr. Pan Jawan. And Dr. Pan, or Jawan, right? He is Renee's brother-in-law. That means he's my brother-in-law lah. Okay. And they live a couple of streets away from my house. And so basically we're neighbors. And we have had many of these conversation of faith and conversation of science and things of that nature. Then I thought, hey, I'm doing this series on the doctrine of humanity. Can you come on board to speak to us on the origins of humanity from a scientist perspective? And then after that, talk about how a typical scientist or some scientists may view what a human being is. For example, the mind and the body, you know, what's the relationship between the mind and the body from certain scientific, certain views of certain scientists, all right? That will be what we'll be talking about in the next session after this. So, I shouldn't take too, but after this, please do feel free to ask difficult questions, right? Because you cannot ask me, right? Biology C4. Okay, so ask the biologist here. And so I'll pass the time over to Dr. Pan.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you everyone for having me here today. As Stephen said, my name is Jiawen. And just a little bit about me. Oops, let me see if we can get this working. Just press here. Okay. All right, so maybe the elephant in the room, right? I know I look very young, but despite my looks, I am 34 years old. I'm happily married to this May, and my wife was the one who made sure that I bolded and highlighted happily, in case there's any doubt. So I'm still young, but maybe not as young as maybe some of you might have thought. So I have a PhD in biology from Duke University in Durham, North Carolina, and that's where some of my familiarity with the topic comes from. My thesis while I was a graduate student there was on the evolution of the olfactory system of fruit flies, actually. So after getting my PhD in 2017, so about 6 years ago, I came back to Malaysia, and I've been working as a scientist with a non-profit research organization called Cancer Research Malaysia for the past 6 years. And my work there, you know, I'm a genomicist, so I study the genomics of breast cancer, specifically Asian breast cancer, with a focus on immuno-oncology and the discovery of predictive biomarkers for targeted therapies. So, yeah, that's my day job. So, a couple of disclaimers before we move forward. So, while I consider myself to be fairly well versed in evolution and genetics, I am not really an expert in very specifically early human evolution or physical anthropology, so that is a lot less familiar to me, and I'm, you know, just speaking more as a biologist in general. So for the purposes of this presentation also, I'm speaking primarily as a scientist first and as a Christian second, right? So I'm taking off a little bit of my Christian hat, putting on, not to say take off fully, but putting the scientist hat on top of the Christian hat. I do not claim to speak for all scientists, right? Scientists have a very large diversity of views. I don't speak for all Christians for that point, or even for Christian scientists, right? I don't speak for all of them. I am a sinful human being who is not infallible. So I may be wrong, probably I'm wrong about a lot of these details. So, and it's also very much possible that I might change my mind in the future about specific conclusions, and especially in light of new evidence or theories that may arise, right? So none of this is that I'm going to present is necessarily fixed in stone. Okay, so the purposes of what I'm trying to present today, my goal is actually not to try and convince you that the modern scientific perspective of human origins is correct, right? That's not really what I'm trying to do today. My goal is to try and make the case that scientists in general, even atheistic scientists, those who operate in the West, they're well-meaning people. I've interacted with them a lot during my graduate studies. They're reasonable people. They have reasons why they believe what they believe, right? And they will be people that your kids might encounter, that you yourself might have encountered as they go off to university or in various different settings. The second thing I will try to do is to maybe suggest that it's also possible to hold to the modern scientific perspective of human origins and also still be a Christian, right? So maybe to introduce some flexibility in different viewpoints, introduce that there are different groups of Christians, perhaps, that have a variety of different takes on the same material. So that's what I'm hoping to do here. Okay. So I actually want to start with the biblical account of creation, right? And I'll go into why later. But as all of you would be very familiar with, in the Bible, God is the creator of the heavens and the earth. And in the Bible, very specifically, God transformed the world from chaos into order in 6 creation days, right? And there's a specific order in which this is done. And of course, he rests on the 7th day. And the Bible also had a little bit of detail on the origin of humanity, right? So a couple of verses that repeats over and over again, specifically that God creates humanity, male and female, in his image and in his likeness, right? And you see this in Genesis, you also see that repeated at various different points. There is a verse, Genesis 2 verse 7, that states specifically God breathes human beings out of dust and breathes life into him, right? So that's Genesis 2 verse 7. And I'm extrapolating a little bit, but in general, the Bible also presents the idea that all human beings descend from a single pair of first humans, which is Adam and Eve, right? And that's probably a more literal interpretation, but most people reading the Bible will probably have that understanding. So what I want to start with actually is a scientific analysis of the biblical account of the origin of humanity, right? So we can put some of these ideas to the test, scientifically speaking, and I'm going to start with, what does that really mean, right? How can we test these ideas scientifically? So what does it mean in general to do a scientific analysis? There are a couple different ways you can think about it, but one way you can think about it is that you start in general with a broad idea, a hypothesis, right? Some of you might have encountered that term. Just an idea, a theory, and something that's interesting, something that makes sense of the world to you. And then you use that account or that idea to make a specific prediction, right? So you have to use that idea to look for something that you can really measure very specifically, and make a prediction about what that measurement will result in. And then you look for evidence to see, of course, you do that measurement, you see if that's correct. And a couple of key points I want to mention is that for scientists, what we hold to as evidence, ideally what we want high quality, measurable, repeatable observations that you can really measure, in the lab, elsewhere in the field repeatedly. And you want these things to have been validated using a variety of different methods, right? You don't want to base all of your conclusions on just one piece of evidence, right? You have many different sources of evidence that hopefully all see the same thing, then you're more confident in what you believe, right? And if the evidence matches the predictions, we are more confident that the idea or story or hypothesis or theory is true. And if the evidence matches 2 different ideas, if you can explain one piece of evidence in 2 different ways, usually what we say is something, we choose the idea that is simpler. And the word for this is parsimony, but in general, the simpler idea is the better idea. Scientists. So if you start from a literal plain reading interpretation of Genesis, you might come to some of these predictions that you could potentially make, right? So other people may disagree with this list that I have here, but my goal is really to illustrate the scientific process. So bear with me a little bit. But some predictions that some people might have from just a literal plain reading interpretation of Genesis is that humanity perhaps is a unique creation in nature. We're different from everything else. We're a special creation out of dust, right? And we should be able to see that in our biology. Some predictions would be that if you look back and try and find the oldest human fossils, you should be able to find stuff that's less than 10,000 years old, right? Because a lot of people, if you trace the genealogically literally, traces back to about 6,000 BC or so. The prediction is that the oldest human fossils will be found in the Middle East, right? Because the Garden of Eden is thought to be somewhere in Iran, Iraq, that area. You would think that the oldest human fossils will appear fully human, as in they have all the characteristics and traits that you associate with modern human beings, because God, of course, created this special human out of nothing, fully formed, right? And finally, not finally, but next is perhaps our genetics that we see in our bodies, the information in our systems, should be consistent with descent from just one pair, right? Adam and Eve, about 100 to 200 generations ago, if you look at the genealogy of the Bible. And two more points is that our DNA, if you just look from that specifically, predicted, should have one point of origin, Adam and Eve, and also it should have a relatively recent point of origin, or again, consistent with the idea of 100 or 200 generations ago. So what does the evidence say in light of these predictions, right? And the first one I want to go to is just very broad, right? The question is humanity unique in biology? And a lot of this probably is, if you think about it, you have encountered a lot of this and you've maybe even noticed this before, but I'm trying to put it together here systematically. If you look, and scientists have seen this since the 1600s, if you look at the different species of animals on Earth, we are very, very similar. If you look at our skeletal system on the left there, there's a laser pointer. Okay, let me see if there's a laser pointer that works. Okay. Oh, wow, okay. Anyway, on the left, that picture shows how similar we are in terms of our skeletal systems to some of the primates and great apes that are thought to be our closest relatives, right? You just look at the musculoskeletal system, you can see very gross similarities. If you look on the right at the picture of the human forelimb, the bone structure in our limbs actually is very, very similar to a lot of other mammals. Even whales, even dogs, and even if you go back further, if you eat a chicken wing, you can actually look and see and tell you'd have one bone, followed by two bones, followed by a bunch of smaller bones to make up your fingers. And this is repeated pretty much everywhere you see in a lot of different organisms, right? So there's a lot of similarities anatomically speaking. On the right bottom, you can look at the pictures of our brain, right? You might think that as humans, maybe what makes us special is our nervous system, our brains, and that sets us apart from other creatures. But as scientists study comparative anatomy between different species, we notice that, yeah, our brains are bigger, our brains are more complex, they're more convoluted, but the regions in our brains that we can see actually match. You can point them back and look at the same regions in rats, the same regions in cats, and they kind of usually do the same things. So there's a lot of similarities in terms of our nervous systems as well, right? So there's pretty much everywhere we look in our biochemical systems, in the different biological pathways that we look, we appear to be almost identical to other animals. So this extends into the idea of our DNA, right? So if you look just into our DNA, we are genetically very similar to other animals. And we are the most similar, of course, first to great apes, and then a little bit less similar, still pretty similar to apes in general. If you go back further, we're very similar to monkeys, and then primates in general, prosimians, and so on and so forth. And if you try and put some numbers on this, the statistics are actually quite amazing, right? And some of you will have seen this before. And the specific number here also depends on how you measure a little bit. So you'll see estimates when we look at the DNA comparing us and chimpanzees, estimates between 91%, 95%, 98%. It all depends on the specific measurement that you take. But the point I'm trying to make is that it's really high, right? It's not something you would maybe just expect as a special creation to be so similar to other creatures that are out there. And more so than just the mere fact of the similarities between us and chimpanzees, is that you can trace this pattern of descending similarity that matches kind of like what humans see in general, in species that you would just think, looking at them morphologically, to be very different, right? So 91% similar to chimpanzees, 89% similar to mice, which are mammals, 85% to cows, which are also mammals, but a little bit further. Cats, 80%, chickens, 62%, fruit flies, which I've studied for a very long time, 28% similarity. So we have a lot of very similar overlapping genetic pathways between ourselves and fruit flies. And even bananas, right? Which, if you think about it, why would we have any similarity to a banana at all? That's surprising, let's put it that way. But we have 17% similar genes, right? So, and then another thing that maybe a lot of people think we are perhaps different from nature is that, you know, we have these emotions, we have these social systems, we have these feelings that sometimes you don't recognize in other that you don't see in the natural world out of hand. But a lot of you, if you watch National Geographic, you might have heard about some of these things. On the left are elephants. Elephants are very social, very intelligent, with really, really good memories, and they form very strong bonds between each other and also with their trainers. And on the left is a group of elephants expressing grief over the passing of one of their members, right? So grief is something that at least you can see in some form in nature. On the right is also something very similar in whales. So certain species of whales, the mother whale, if her offspring, if her baby passes away, as they move along, they will support the dead whale for 3, 6, 9, 12 hours, a long period of time, in what scientists think is a process of grieving, right? Where before they slowly let the baby whale that is dead, you know, go down into the depths. So they'll try and keep it afloat for a significant period of time. So there are some precursors to the emotions and sociality that we see in humans in other animals as well. And this one's really interesting because another thing that you might think set humans apart is our sense of morality, right? Our sense of fairness, our sense of justice. We are moral creatures. But actually, there are beginnings of these behaviors, you know, in monkeys as well. So this paper in Nature talks about monkeys rejecting unequal play, and it's a really funny story, right? On the right, you have macaques. So these are macaque monkeys, and you can give them rewards for certain and exchange them for certain things, right? So this monkey is told to press a button, and the button will give him a little token. He can exchange that token for gifts, right? So the scientist here gives this monkey, you give me this token, I'll give you a cucumber. So I give you one token. Sorry, the monkey gives the researcher a token, you give back one cucumber, and you keep doing that for a while, gets used to it, no problems with it, you eat that cucumber, no problem. Then he sets up another cage right next to him. Same type of monkey, different individual. They do the same thing, they press the button, they get a token. And then he gives the second monkey, instead of a cucumber, gives him a grape, right? So I'm going to feed the second monkey a grape in the presence and observation of the first monkey. So, of course, the second monkey loves the grape, but the first monkey is going to see the second monkey, and he's going to be really upset. So the next time that the scientist feeds the first monkey, the monkey gives him a token, he gives him a cucumber. What the monkey did was he took the cucumber and threw it at the researcher's face, right? Rejecting it, and he kept on doing it until he was, okay, I deserve a grape, I should get a grape. And so there are semblances of morality and justice and fairness that you can actually see in primate behavior as well. Okay, so transitioning from the idea that humans are unique in nature into some of the other predictions that may have to do with the fossil evidence, right? So what do the fossils say? And I had a few of those predictions that I stated in the beginning. One of them is that, you know, you might predict the oldest human fossils that will be discovered to be less than 10,000 years old. But physical anthropologists have gone up and done surveys, and they've looked in various different places, and they've found the oldest human fossils date back to about 300,000 years old. right? So on the left, you have one that was found in Morocco, dated roughly that age. And on the right, you have another skull that was found in South Africa, dated also similarly between 200 and 300,000 years old. And these are anatomically modern humans, right? So they're not a different species. They have the same brain size, they have the same jaw structure. They're anatomically modern. There's no reason for us to believe that there are different species or different types of creatures, but they've been dated through a variety of different methods, which I'll talk about a bit more later, back to that period of time. And I also gave this away already, but the prediction was, if from a literal interpretation of Genesis, that they would be found in the Middle East, but that was not the case. They were all found in Africa, and it's not just these two, right? Basically, all of the old human fossils are all found in Africa. Then the next prediction, perhaps, was that oldest human fossils will appear fully human. And we know as we continue to accumulate fossil evidence that that's not necessarily true, right? So the oldest human fossils, we see some, but not all of modern human traits, right? So if you look back and you look at skulls that have been assigned to similar human species, you see the brain sizes are a little bit smaller, you see exaggerated brow ridges. Another clear difference that you see is the teeth get bigger and bigger to resemble those of more like great apes rather than modern day humans. So there is evidence that these oldest human fossils, they don't have all of the same human traits that we do. Okay. And then finally, the prediction for fossils is that we should see these human fossils appear suddenly in the fossil record, right? And you would expect that if they Adam and Eve were the very, very first human-like creatures, that you wouldn't see anything else that was before them that was human-like, right? And again, this is not consistent with what physical anthropologists have found, right? If you go back and you look in what we have close to a century now of fossil evidence, you have lots and lots of different populations of different types of species of human-like creatures that now scientists have dated all the way back millions of years, right? Up to 5 to 7 million years. And it's not just one individual, it's not just one lineage, it's a whole family tree, which I'm showing on the left here, of species. And again, you can see a clear progression in the fossils on the right, that there's an increase over time in brain sizes. There's also a tendency in the skull to have smaller jaws and smaller teeth, all the way down to modern day humans. And again, all of these were found in Africa. So one of the things I want to address here is that sometimes people think that our fossil evidence is very sparse and that we only have a small handful. Maybe we're basing all our evidence on just like 10 bone fragments. But I want to emphasize that actually we have thousands of early hominin fossils, right? So this is not based on just a very small amount of evidence. So you see here 2 museum collections that I found on the web, and you can see just how large your collections are. And these are just 2 museums out of dozens, maybe even hundreds of different academic institutions that have collections of similar sizes, right? So we have literally thousands of these different fossils to draw conclusions from. Another thing that people say sometimes is, oh, your fossils are fragmentary, they're just little bits and pieces of, you don't even know where they're from, they're not very complete. But actually, if you look at the fossil record again, we do have examples of almost close to complete fossil species, fossil hominin species. And this is one example from just one species that date back to about 5 million years ago. And even in this one species, you already have, 3 or 4 close, near complete skeletons. And as you get closer in time, you get more and more close to complete skeletons, right? So the fossils are pretty complete. At least we have good examples that are pretty complete. Next, we'll talk a little bit about modern dating methods, because this is another point of contention. People say, how do you know that these fossils are really old, right? And that used to be a good kind of like counter argument, perhaps, back when we only had 1 or 2 dating methods, which was maybe 50, 60 years ago. But we've come a long way since, right? So scientists have developed, here I show, maybe 8 or 10, but there are something like 20, 30, 40, perhaps different ways you can date materials, and different different dating methodologies work better on different timelines, as you can see here. And we have now a large variety of different methodologies based on what we call clock-like measurable physical processes, right? So these are all physics-based, right? These are not necessarily biological, but they include stuff like hydration of obsidian, amino acid racemization, looking at trapped electrons, looking at the electron spin in the molecules that you can detect. So as our instruments get more and more sensitive, we can devise more and more ways in which we can calculate the age of a lot of these samples. And the point I want to make is that we don't, these conclusions about the age of the fossils are not based on one method, they're based on a combined analysis of many, multiple different methods, right? So that is really the strength of the conclusions that modern day scientists have come to. So another prediction, perhaps, is from our DNA. You might think that our DNA is consistent with descent from a single mating pair, right? You should see like maybe a V shape with all of our genes and DNAs coming from a single point. But if you look in our DNA and you look at the variation in our genome, you'll see that that's actually not consistent with origin from a single mating pair, right? So when you have what we call this pattern of just a few individuals leading to the rest of the population, that's called a founder effect. That leads to very specific clues and marks in the genome. You can see that in cheetahs, you can see that in some of the endangered species. There's very clear clues in the genome when that kind of thing happens. It's called a population bottleneck leading to a founder effect. We don't see that in humans, right? So when you look at the variation in the human genome, scientists calculate that this suggests we've always been in populations of at least 1,000 people at minimum. That's really the bottom estimate, right? Most scientists think that it's never dipped below, 10,000 or 100,000 even. And so there's no evidence for descent from a single mating pair. Another prediction, perhaps, is that our DNA should have a single point of origin, right? We all came from the same set of family, one single family tree, one lineage. But actually, as we look in more detail, that's also not true, right? So Svante Pääbo, and some of you might have heard of this, is a Swedish researcher who works in this field. He won the 2022 Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine for sequencing using ancient, very old DNA, sequencing the Neanderthal genome. And he showed from his analysis that in modern day humans, between 1 to 4% of our DNA is actually of Neanderthal origin. And that means that humans actually did mate with other human populations that were extant and overlapped maybe that many tens of thousands years ago. And since then, we found that not just with Neanderthals, but with also another whole species of humans called Denisovans. And the picture is really complex, right? We basically have had multiple what we call introgressions or introductions of genetic material into our genome from different sources. We have the Denisovans, we have Neanderthals, we have humans who are split for many generations and then come back together again. That's the little blip you see on the right there. So there are multiple points of origins. It's a very complicated picture. It's not consistent with a single point of origin. And finally, the prediction is perhaps our DNA should have a recent point of origin. And that's also, again, doesn't seem to be the case, right? So we have evidence from looking at your mitochondria. So these are DNA that's inherited matrilineally, just passed from mother to daughter, You also have you're looking at Y chromosomes from guys, right? So this is patrilineal DNA that's passed linearly, and these are a little bit more straightforward to measure their origins from. And these all point back to really quite old ages, right? At least 100,000 years, 200,000 years. And as we look at more and more people, we look and survey people from more parts of the world. This date keeps going older and older. And that will continue to be so as we sequence more and more people. Okay, so to contrast with that, so what is then the modern scientific account for the origin of humanity? This will be familiar to pretty much everyone, but the modern scientific account is that the universe, of course, began with the Big Bang 14 billion years ago. And the Earth formed as part of this wider solar system about 4.5 billion years ago, so really old, billions and billions of years. The second key concept of the scientific understanding of the human origins is that we are part of what we call the universal tree of life, right? So we share a common ancestor with all other extant life forms, from monkeys, great apes, other mammals, even down to insects, plants, bacteria. We all share a common ancestor. And that means they are just really, 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 really distant cousins to every other living thing, right? So that's the hypothesis here. So that, of course, is the theory of evolution by natural selection. And I know that can be a difficult topic in Christian circles to discuss, and there are many different viewpoints on this. But I want to provide here some of perhaps what I feel to be the strongest evidence for evolution, and just a few case examples. So the first one I want to talk about is whale and horse fossil record, right? So evidence for whales and horses evolving from something completely different. And the reason why I choose this is because the fossil records for whales and horses is especially well preserved in the fossil record, right? So we have lots and lots of fossils of specifically these two kinds of animals. And another reason why I chose these two is because the beginning of where they started from to the end point of today, they clearly look very different, right? So Christians often have the concept of kinds or species, and the argument is that, okay, maybe you can see evolution within a kind, but you can't see between two different kinds. Well, in the case of whales, it's clear that a whale is a very different kind of animal compared to something like a hippopotamus, which is what is most similar. What is the most similar other animal to a whale? So something that started off looking really whale-like, looking a bit more hippopotamus-like, maybe a shriveled up version of hippopotamus on the left side there. Populations of these types of animals evolve over many millions of years again into what we saw, into what we see today, right? On the left, that's the clear progression of something that looked a little bit more like a hippo, probably dwelt mostly on land, likes water, was aquatic, into something that pretty much is just 100% in the deepest depths of the deepest oceans today, right? So very clear differences. Similarly, for our horses, you get a progression for something that was really small, that looked like a mouse deer, right? So very different from a modern day horse. Slowly over time, their feet structure changed, the size changed, their bone structure changed into something as big as a horse today, right? So very clear difference in sizes and shape. The second one I want to talk about is actually one of my favorite stories from science, which is the story of Tiktaalik. And some of you, again, may have heard this before. I think it's really cool. Tiktaalik is a species of fish that is purported to be one of the that is evidence for the transition between land and Earth, right? So according to the scientific theory, all Earth began in the sea. We slowly over time moved out from the sea to live on land. And these are perhaps the link between something like a fish and something like a modern day amphibian that lives in between that. And the reason I like this story is because this is an example of evolution, the theory of evolution making a very specific prediction. And then when we look, and then scientists using that prediction to make a discovery, right? So Tiktaalik was discovered by a scientist called Neil Shubin in the University of Chicago. And he basically specifically was very interested in looking in trying to find evidence for the transition between the sea and land. And so based on modern scientific evolutionary theory, geology, physical processes, the dating of carbon sites, he identified, based on my theories, we will probably find animals like this in a very, very specific part of Canada, in the deep Arctic, right? And nobody's ever gone to those places before and looked, and there was no evidence that he would be correct. But he went over there, and over a period of years, a few years, he made excavations, and he managed to find exactly what he was looking for, right? A transitional fossil of a fish, what is clearly a fish with scales, that also had a lot of features in its arms and legs, rudimentary arms and legs that resemble modern modern day amphibians. So interesting and very cool story, in my opinion. The next part of the modern scientific theory is, of course, the evolution of mankind from non-human ancestors, right? So similar to every other thing on Earth, we evolved from a common ancestor, and in this case, the most similar ancestor is with great apes, and we diverged from chimpanzees and bonobos roughly about 5 to 7 million years ago. So continuing from that story, after we diverged from great apes, scientists think that there existed many other different populations of humans. From one of them, one tree or one branch is which we evolved from. It's the Heidelbergensis species tree. But there were many other family tree and family branches and family lineages that split off and didn't survive to modern day, right? And again, it is thought that we evolved from and also interbred with a lot of these other populations of human-like creatures. And once we did evolve, what is thought to have happened in the early days of human beings is that we started to radiate out of Africa, right? So there's this saying in scientific circles that we are all Africans, because if you trace our roots, they all lead back to Africa, right? So the idea is that Homo sapiens originated from Africa about 200,000 years ago. We slowly, from that point of origin, spread throughout the world. And then we've interbred with other existing Homo populations as we encounter them in different spots in Europe and Asia, right? So that's the idea. And the reason why these theories are compelling is because of the predictions. So just like I showed you, right? It's because of the predictions they're able to make. And when you go and look at the evidence matches the prediction, right? So for example, the old age of the universe, if you use that as your hypothesis or your model, you would predict that the oldest Earth rocks should date back billions of years, which is what we found. Meteorite samples should date back billions of years, which is also what we found. Moon samples from Mars, other planets should date back about the same time. That's also what we found. If you look at geological processes, you look at patterns with annual cyclical processes, they should date back many hundreds of thousands, not millions of years, depending on the specific processes. And that is indeed what scientists have found. Similarly, with the universal tree of life, that allows us to make certain sets of predictions, right? That all living things should share the same biochemistry. That if you take, if you look at the fossil record, you should be able to find transitional forms. And what I also like is, this is quite interesting. This theory predicts that if you take even two very distinctly related species, if you take a gene from one species, you transfer it to another, it should kind of still work, which is really mind-blowing if you think about it, right? You have no, if you take a gene from a yeast, you transfer it to a fruit fly, you take that same gene, you transfer it to a mouse, you take that same gene, you transfer it to a human, you expect that, those genes probably shouldn't work, but actually they do. And well, the reason why that works is, we think it's because of we share common ancestry. So that's the same case repeated over and over again for all of these different theories, right? So the evolution of mankind from non-human ancestors, again, has its own set of predictions, which I've alluded to, that they should be found in Africa, they should date back to a certain period of time, and these have all been validated. And also, some predictions regarding early human and Homo sapien populations. Again, I've already mentioned some of these, that they are hundreds of thousands of years old, they have transitional features. And a couple of cool things that from non-biological evidence is that actually if you look in Africa, you find not just the highest genetic diversity, you also find the highest phenotypic diversity, right? You have Africans who are really, really tall. You have Africans who are really, really small, pygmies. You have Africans that are in between all manners of shapes and sizes, all manners of skin color, so on and so forth. And you also interestingly see the highest diversity of languages in Africa, right? So if you look at just the different forms of languages that are part of the human experience, no other continent besides Africa has the clicking. I don't know if some of you have heard that. Some of those languages, that's only found in Africa, right? And that's an example of how diverse how the highest diversity of the human experience really can be found actually in Africa. And that's all consistent with the idea that all humans are Africans originally, right? So, haven't been keeping track of time, hopefully. Is it still okay? Okay. So, next, can we reconcile the biblical and scientific accounts? Is the big question, of course, to follow up from this, right? So now taking off my scientific hat a little bit, putting on the Christian hat a bit more. How do we reconcile these two seemingly on the surface very, very different accounts? I'm not going to go into an exhaustive list. I'm not a theologian, of course. I'm a biologist by training, and I'll let, I think, probably Stephen speak to a lot of these in future sessions. But here I want to introduce maybe two potential options, right? And the first one being perhaps a non-literal interpretation of the Genesis account. And I took this from some of Stephen's notes from another presentation. Genesis 1-3 seems to be full of symbolism. The structure of Genesis 1 suggests perhaps a poetic literary genre. So the idea of a garden, trees, fruits, serpents, all lend themselves to symbolic interpretations, and even the name Adam and Eve themselves have very strong symbolic meanings, right? Of course, the counter argument to that is that Genesis 1-3 in the Bible also seems to have meant to be perhaps was meant to be understood as genuine history in terms of the original hearers. They probably would have understood that Adam and Eve were historical people, and there's no break between Adam and Eve in material that is definitely historical, right? New Testament writers in different verses believed and thought that Adam was a historical person, but the caveat to that, the counter argument is that, similar to how the original hearers believed in a version of the world, of a cosmological model that is very different from the modern scientific account. For example, the existence of a firmament that separates waters above from waters below that we don't really believe in today anymore. So this does not mean that Christians today are bound to these specific beliefs. So option one, a non-literal interpretation of the Genesis account, and I think Stephen will probably speak more on this perhaps in future sessions. So option two is a bit more scientific, and coming from the science, a second option perhaps is to reconsider what it means to be the first human. And I'm calling this option the genealogical Adam and Eve, and this was a theory that's thought of by a scientist called Joshua Swamidath in the States, who was both a Christian as well, and who's an evangelical Christian as well. And this is the idea that on the left, the figure there is how we traditionally think of lineage, right? It's usually either patrilineal or matrilineal, where you have grandparents, great-grandparents, you have a tribe, a clan, and everyone descends from a few individuals in the beginning, right? You have you follow either your descent by your father, or you follow in a matrilineal culture, you follow it by your mother. But if you think about it, that's not really all of our ancestors, right? Each of us have 2 parents, but we have 4 grandparents. We have 8 great-grandparents. We have 16 great-great-great-grandparents. And this is an exponential progression, right? So very, very quickly, if you look at our ancestry, within 20 or 30 generations, the number of your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparents exceeds the number of humans that have ever existed. And that happens fairly quickly, much more quickly than you would think. Within 20 or 30 generations, every person today will have the same set of ancestors. And this is called the identical ancestors point, right? So we can use this concept to come up to think a little bit further and say, because of that, any single pair of humans before 5000 BC, you can think of them as universal ancestors of every person today, if they have a living descendant, right? And if you reconsider what it means to be the first human, perhaps Adam and Eve were merely the first people in this wider population to be selected as his representatives, as God's representatives and God's likeness, right? So being in the image of God. And why was it Adam and Eve, why was it Adam specifically who was selected? We don't know. It's really difficult for us to answer. There's probably not a specific set of characteristics that we can. It's probably not that much smarter. He wasn't that much faster. He wasn't that much more moral than any of the other population. But that's not up for us to decide, right? That's entirely God's prerogative. So difficult for us to answer, but a trivial question for God. So whoever this first person that was selected in this wider population, within 30 generations of his existence, every living person can reasonably count him as a direct genealogical ancestor. So not necessarily the sole ancestor, but definitely an ancestor, right? And this model is consistent with modern science as long as we continue to allow for the existence of other human populations at the time in which Adam and Eve's descendants continued to interbreed with. Okay, so a couple of summaries, points, and my conclusion here. So the modern scientific account, as far as, in my opinion, of human origins, is a compelling interpretation of all the available evidence. And that allows scientists to make useful predictions, right? Like I've shown the process earlier. And a lot of these predictions have been repeatedly validated with new observations, right? So for example, it's not just interpretation of previous evidence, but it also allows us to make, if we go and look out, if a meteorite from the solar system were to impact the Earth tomorrow, and we go and look at the dates that correspond to that meteorite, we predict that they will match back billions of years. And that allows us a framework to continue to make these observations, to make these predictions. And they haven't been, well, they've mostly been correct so far, right? Let's put it that way. The current scientific evidence, in my opinion, does not match the predictions that are put forth by a literal or traditional interpretation of Adam and Eve as the first and only human creatures who have ever existed, right? So I don't think that's compatible. However, you can perhaps reconcile the scientific and biblical accounts of human origins, maybe through a non-literal interpretation of the biblical account, or perhaps a redefining of what it means for Adam and Eve to be first humans. So that's pretty much what I have. And hopefully that was okay to follow, and I'm happy to take questions.
Yeah, so before you ask any questions of theological nature, next week it is the origins of human, the theologian speaks. Right? So because we have had so many of these conversations over lunch, over taufufa, and over other things, right? And so we put together this series. Okay, so there is the scientist speaks, and then after that we have the theologian speaks. How do we make sense of how various Christian groups of individuals make sense of these data? We'll talk about young Earth creationism, old Earth creationism, theistic evolution. Swami Das' book. William Lane Craig has a new book on this as well, talking about Adam and Eve probably could have been Homo heidelbergensis, something like that. Okay, so we're going to talk about all of that next week. But this week, let's have the questions on the thing of his expertise. Yeah. But of course, you can ask him. So, how can you be a Christian and a scientist at the same time? Ask him the question. Again, you can only ask questions this week and maybe in 2 weeks' time to him. Don't ask me anything about this one, right? Correct? Okay. My biology tell again, SPM C4, C4. Okay. So ask him today. No point asking me later. Need the microphone because Zoom people cannot hear.
Not that short. My question is on evolution, right? Because every time I speak to Christian many years back, it's like evolution is such a taboo.
Yeah.
But my personal take on this is that evolution can happen across generation. And in the scientific world, right, evolution doesn't just mean the look of it, right? But would the evolution of DNA even happen?
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you.
So great question. And evolution is actually primarily a genetic process, right? The DNA is the means in which evolution happens. So everything that you see morphologically, actually the roots, the explanation of that comes from the DNA, right? So yes, you can see that in the DNA as well. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your wonderful exposition. If only you were my Form 6 science, you were my Form 6 science teacher, it would be much better life for us. There will be some assumptions made by the scientists putting forward these theories.
Yes.
So one of them would be scientific laws remain the same from the beginning of how it all began.
Yes.
So that's another assumption that may have to be one reason why we don't have to take things as conclusive. So F is equals to mg may not always have been the case. But not to say everything was miraculous. If you accept miracles is departure from Newtonian physics or something like that. Second question is the absoluteness of the evidence. I gather that you're saying the evidence is building up, that our origins was or evolution, as we all came from one cell, which is how I simplistically try to understand, right? And what life is from that one cell. So again, in my very very basic and primitive way of understanding science, theory is one category. And then you're getting evidence to back up the theory.
Correct.
But because it is time-based, right? You don't know what you find next. So the assumption is I won't find anything 10 years, 20 years, 100 years from now that suddenly puts a hole or bursts the bubble of what you are. Not you are. I mean who are accumulating this evidence for a theory which remains a theory. I just wanted to check these two assumptions. And I just wanted to double check. My third question was double check what you meant by the genealogical solution to marry the last two bullets together. Were you saying that because of that, that I was totally amazed by that great grandfather? So somewhere there's Adam, but there were others. So the marrying of this, or rather the solution being proffered here is that's the Adam that the Bible chose. Bible meaning, if you say God, right? But there were others as well. Is that, did I understand the genealogical? Okay.
There was one specific individual, even though among a wider group of existing individuals.
Okay. Thank you very much.
So thanks. Those are all really, really good questions, and very, very great points. I'll try and address them in turn. So the idea that scientific physical laws have remained constant throughout the existence of the Earth is an assumption, and that it's something that we can potentially start to measure as we figure out more and more ways. That's the realm of physics, right? That's not a biological question, and we have been able to do some pretty amazing things in physics, right? You can measure pretty much all the way back now, people think, to close to the start of the Big Bang for certain physical processes. Of course, that's only for a small handful of processes, perhaps. But as we go along, we could perhaps delve into that and accumulate evidence whether that's true or not, right? Currently, that's an assumption, but we can probably test that as we go along forward. So you're right to point that out. Whether that, I will say that there is no evidence that the laws of physics have changed, right? As far as we know, they've remained constant throughout time and space. The second point I think you mentioned is yes, how theories can change over time. And you're absolutely right? Science is always open to change in the light of new evidence, observations, as well as theories. And that's been demonstrated in something like physics and geology, right? So physics, before Einstein, everybody thought it was a Newtonian model. There's no, it's just a very simple, gravity attracts everything. And then Einstein comes along and revolutionized what it means, what gravity is, right? And in geology, a lot of people thought that continents were static and they don't move. And it took a long period of time and accumulating evidence, new observations that weren't explained by the old model for us to come up with the idea that there's continental drift. And similarly in biology, that could be true, right? We could start accumulating evidence that doesn't fit with our standard models. And that could force a radical change in how we think about biology. That's always still a possibility. And I will say as scientists, we welcome that, right? So I can only speak to the current best evidence, and that's always open to change. I think that was your third point, sorry.
Third point is the Swami Das one.
Genealogy, yeah. So the genealogical model, you're exactly right. There's an existing group of individuals that are probably human-like, and then God at some point within that group selected one specific individual. This, or he could even have maybe specially created one unique individual. I mean, that's allowed for in the idea, in the theory. But there were other individuals, and he was merely the first to be selected. Yeah, and that's actually an interesting concept that might relate to other points. Because we as human beings, we're always concerned about the first, right? This transition. How do you first know something happens? What does it mean to be first? And that's related to something like, if you're a child, what does it mean to first become an adult? At what point? And it's really, the problem is you're trying to put specific, discrete categories on what's really just a continuous variable, right? And it's really hard for us as humans to do that, right? We don't know where is that boundary. But of course, that's a human problem. That's not a problem for God. Yeah, and that's kind of the same concept I'm trying to apply here.
Yeah. Questions from Zoom. After the question from Zoom. Question from Zoom. The first question was, what is your view on Craig's Heidelbergensis view?
Craig's Heidelbergensis view, I think, is perfectly reasonable. Yeah, I don't necessarily. Sorry.
Okay, yeah, please go ahead.
So the view by William Lane Craig is that the first human being, right? So like I said, this problem of what is the first human is that maybe he wasn't even Homo sapiens, right? I don't know if I can go back here. Okay.
Maybe the theory is that maybe Adam wasn't a Homo sapien.
Yeah.
Maybe Adam was a Heidelbergensis. That is the William Lane Craig's book, the most recent book, In Search of Adam and Eve. Yeah.
Okay. Don't know if it's not showing up
Quest
anymore.
for Adam or Eve or something.
Sorry?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So you can see here, sapiens didn't come from out of nowhere. It came from other species, and one of them is Heidelbergensis, which has a long evolutionary history. So William Lane Craig's idea is that maybe Adam kind of like the first human, what we label between non-human and human, or pre-human and human, somewhere further down rather than up. And I think that's reasonable. Yeah, again, that just speaks to the problem of where you draw the line, and it's, as human beings, we don't know, right? You can just pick up any point.
First question is probably a simple one. How long have you been a Christian, Jaron?
Oh, yeah. I grew up in a Christian family, so I grew up in Kuching mostly, at part of the SIB church there, and now I worship in CDPC Puchong. Okay. So yeah. So
your pursuit of science was obviously when you were quite fairly mature Christian.
Yeah, I will say from a personal point of view that I've always been interested in science. I loved biology as a teenager, and there's a reason why I went to study it. And it was a struggle. I'm not going to kind of like shy away from the fact that this is really difficult as a Christian to kind of grasp and reconcile with your beliefs, right? And it's something I struggled with in college. It's something I struggled with in graduate school, and it took many years for me to come to this kind of like happy, not happy, but at least contented, coexistence, I would say.
So that's actually my question, that being a scientist and pursuing science, were there very distinct points in your pursuit where you felt that your faith was being challenged?
Oh.
And how do you overcome that?
Yeah.
What were those points and points?
Oh, absolutely. Great question. I first, I don't know if I'm running out. Okay, I encountered this as a college student, right? And I think this would probably speak to a lot of you as you worry about your kids leaving to colleges or universities, or you yourself having gone to university colleges. They will encounter these ideas in biology. This is the foundation of basically every biology class in university. And similarly, when I encountered these ideas, it was a challenge. And what's maybe made worse is the fact that back when I was a student, at least, the third option to reconcile these two was not really an option, right? A lot of them was you're either a creationist or you're an evolutionist. There's no in between, right? Theistic evolution as an accepted viewpoint was really it had its beginnings, maybe in that point, but it only came to the fore maybe just like 5-10 years ago. So for many years I struggled until I kind of landed upon an early form of theistic evolution, which I clung to, and I was like, okay, that's acceptable to me. I can hold both things together, and it's not in contradiction. And and I'm happy now that viewpoint has continued to develop, and that's now a fairly accepted viewpoint among Christian academics, at least.
We'll talk about theistic evolution next week, as well. I might even provide a little bit of critique on that. There's a question online. Can you tell more about our interbreeding with the Neanderthals and the Denisovans?
Oh, so that's really an interesting story, right? I would say that that's probably not what we expected to find as scientists when we looked at our DNA, right? The prevailing idea before looking at our DNA, before we had access to this ancient DNA, was just based on the physical evidence. What you always tend to see is you have these other human populations, and Homo sapiens come along and kind of wipes out everything else, right? Everything else just dies, everything else just disappears. And the idea is that, we are Homo sapiens, we're really aggressive, we're really violent, we're really different in some way, or maybe we're better competitors, and we displace all of these other human populations. That was a prevailing idea at the time. And then it was really surprising when we got to actually look at ancient DNA from Neanderthals and actually sequence them and compare our DNA side by side. Actually, a lot of our DNA is coming from them. And the only way that could have happened is by interbreeding. So that has forced a really big change in how we perceive the interactions between humans and other early human species, other hominin species, right? So there's probably still warfare, but there's also, what happens on the side of that, what is the framework for love and intermarriage between these very different groups? That's still an active area of research, is how I'll put it.
So, do I have Neanderthal genes?
Yes.
Yes.
So, pretty much all of us, except for parents, if you lived in certain lineages from Africa, we all have Neanderthal DNA. And actually, as Asians, we have more Neanderthal DNA than a lot of other, maybe Europeans or other ethnicities. So I think generally, as Homo sapiens in general, we share 1 to 4%, but I think Asians, we're closer to like 8%, if I'm not mistaken. So even more.
So you're 8% Neanderthal. Okay. Yeah.
And that's not a pejorative anymore, right? You can proudly say, I am 8% Neanderthal, because the more we know of Neanderthals now, they're not these brutish, primitive beings. They are very intelligent. They're probably very social. They have practices and rituals that are very, very similar to human. They're probably their brains are actually bigger than humans, so they're probably even smarter than we are. Maybe not as aggressive, but it's not a pejorative to say we are 8% Neanderthal. Yeah.
Any more questions? Yep, come. We still have 10 minutes of Q&A. Huh? Make full use of it.
I'm very, very curious, because every time we speak about humans, right? The Neanderthals look like humans to me. I always assume they are humans. So it's like from the conversation, it sounded as if we are so special, we are humans. The rest that look like us are not humans. I'm very confused. Can you just kind of clarify that
Yes.
and where did that come from?
Yeah, yeah. So that's great, right? As you go back in recent history and you look at pre-human populations, they still look a lot like us. They still look, they still have a lot of the same characters we do. Morphologically, brain size-wise, they look very similar. And it's really, really hard to say they are not human. I totally agree with that. And I would say that we shouldn't say they are not human, right? We should still consider them to be human. But of course, the problem comes when you go later and later and later, when you start to get 3 million year old, 5 million year old fossils that really look a lot more like chimpanzees, right? They have really huge kind of like jaws. They have really small brains. They probably didn't, they probably have the same kind of like mental characteristics as you would think of chimpanzees today. Would you consider those humans? There has to be a line, right? Obviously, there was something before and then something after that we now call human. Where's that line? That line's always, so William Lane Craig says Heidelbergensis. You know, you can say maybe early Homo sapiens. You can pull it even all the way back down to Homo erectus. At some point, there's probably a difference in characteristic that separates humans from non-humans. But as I said, this is a continuous, gradual change, and where you draw that line is a subjective question. Yeah.
So in line with that, what you said and your answer to him earlier, and to illustrate clearer this one, can you explain to me why do scientists say there's no such thing as a chicken?
Why there is no such thing as a chicken? If you're talking about
the continuum. Yeah.
the continuum of where chickens come from, right? Talking about the idea of chickens as a species. There was probably something that looked not like a chicken, that at some point started to look like a chicken, right? So scientists think that birds originate from dinosaurs, right? So a dinosaur is obviously not a chicken. And then as the dinosaur changed over time, it started getting smaller, growing wings, getting feathers. At some point, it started looking a little bit more like a chicken, and a little bit more like a chicken, and a little bit more like a chicken. But at what point can you say a point and say, oh, that's a chicken? You know it when you see it at the end, but where does it become a chicken in the middle? You are drawing an arbitrary line in a gradual change, right? In a gradual process.
So there are no chickens in nature. That which you call chicken is because you call it chicken, because the humans call it chicken. All right? It is a continuous line of evolution,
Yeah.
right? From one animal to another animal, there is no chicken.
I will say that, I mean,
Biology says there's no chickens. Yeah.
there are chickens today, but we don't know when chickens started. Yeah.
Last one. I tell you, after this,
I'll be back in a few weeks. You can ask me more questions.
he'll be back in a couple of weeks. He'll be back in a couple of weeks to talk about moist robots. Okay. Moist. Are we moist robots? Are we AI? Okay. So, going once,
Steven,
going twice.
Steven.
Oh, Zoom. What the?
There's a question I asked in Zoom.
Zoom question? Oops. Oh. Okay, what is the difference between genetics versus genealogical descent? Yeah.
Oh, the question is, what's the difference between genetic Adam and genealogical Adam?
Yeah. So the idea of ancestry, you often think is related to our genetics, right? Some people say, like, if you do a genetic test, you can say, oh, you're 80% Asian, 20% European. You're 90% Caucasian, 10% Sub-Saharan African, something like that. So that's a genetic idea of ancestry, right? And that is true in the sense that, you share 50% of genes with one parent, you share 25% of genes with with a grandparent, and your similarities start decreasing the further back you go, right? So when you go back in time and say, Adam is a genealogical descendant, that means that he's genealogical ancestor. That means that we may not share any genetic similarities with Adam because it's so dilute, right? You know, you go from 50%, 25%, 12%, half of and half of that. So the percentage of genes, actual similarity genetically with Adam at that point is minute, tiny, right? But at the same time, they are still an ancestor. They're still what we call in our ancestry, genealogical ancestry. So that's the key difference there between genetics and genealogy. I would say. Hopefully that helps. Oh, okay. Stephen, just a query. Are we able to get a scientific counter-argument to what was discussed today to support the biblical viewpoint?
A scientific counter-argument to the scientific argument, that doesn't make sense. This is the scientific account. Okay. Now, of course, if you disagree with the scientific account, the solution is to do better science.
Yeah.
Right? Okay, win the Nobel Prize as a result of that. Okay. The solution to the way to tear down a scientific theory is to present a better scientific theory. So you're most welcome to the attempt. Yeah.
And that doesn't necessarily have to be new evidence, right? If you have a new theory that better explains the existing evidence, that also is valid. You just have to come, just scientists say, what's your theory, right? And then you have to compare it on that basis.
Yeah.
So.
Hopefully, nobody's faith shaken. Kelvin, got some more? Got some more. Got some more on Zoom. Which is it?
Right now. Oh, do you think that Adam and Eve are a selection of human race and not as creation, as stated in the Bible? Okay. So I guess I can speak personally. I presented two options of how you can reconcile. I am actually not. I don't have I think both are equally valid, and to me, it doesn't matter which one is correct, so long as there is a path to reconcile, right? So I am in favor of the non-literal interpretation of Scripture. That's my personal, meaning. But I would say, what actually happened. I think there are multiple ways. I don't have a I don't necessarily have a horse in the race in either argument. Yeah.
So he's more into option A. He's more into option A.
But option B is valid.
If option B turns out to be true, he's also very happy. He'll also be happy. Okay. If no more, then can Elder Baget close us in prayer? Yeah.
Lord, in all of this ideas and seeking to understand how it all began and how it all moved forward, we do want to acknowledge before you, because this is just so true, that you are the creator of all things in heaven and on earth. And therefore we belong to you because we were created by you. As to how you did it and how does the Bible explain that stupendous truth is something, Lord, we struggle with, and sometimes we're not sure. We're coming out of the boundaries, we're getting out of the categories, and we're beginning to challenge our own faith. Lord, we ask you, as much as you've never refused to debate with mankind, you've always been there to answer our questions, and where our finite minds cannot comprehend how two things that, or two categories that seemingly look irreconcilable can be harmonized by you, can be synchronized by you. We don't understand all this, Lord, but you want us to search the truth and find the truth in you. So Lord, we pray that, and we thank you for how things have been said so clearly to us today, even though it's propositions that challenge our intellect. Lord, and therefore sometimes begin to challenge our faith. We ask you, Lord, to just be with us as we think about these things and ponder over them. At the same time, acknowledging you as our God, Father who loves us, will never let us go. So thank you, Lord. Be with us this week as we look ahead, as we finish the second half of the CNY, as much as we begin to continue to still cherish our relationships and fellowship with each other. You will bless our time together. Be with us all, our families and friends. We pray all this in Jesus' precious name. Amen.
Join me in giving a hand to Dr. Pan. Okay, so next week, the theologian speaks. That one I got a degree, that one.